and welcome. My name is Blanca Torres-Olave, and I am presenting today with Max Crumley-Effinger. We're both at Loyola University Chicago, and we're really happy and grateful to be able to participate in the Critical International Studies Conference. And a big thank you to Sharon and Dale for organizing this and taking care that everything is in place. I really appreciate all your work. And the title of our presentation today is "The Scar Must Run Deep: Whether Internationalization and Academic Hypermobility in the Anthropocene." So I will walk us through the first part of the presentation, and then Max will take over from there. And before we proceed, I want to, even though Loyola University Chicago does not have a land acknowledgement, we think it's very important to acknowledge that our campus resides within the traditional territories of the Three Fires people, the Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi, and as well as many other tribes that were located here as a site of trade, gathering, and healing. We recognize that indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving today. Complications that we ran into when we first started talking about this topic was, when we talk about higher education's internationalization, we could have gone into many different directions, talking about study abroad, international students, transnational education. And at the end of the day, what we decided is that we needed to start with ourselves. We are scholar practitioners, scholars, academics, and so the notion of academic mobility and the culture of academia for us was really critical to address. And what we really want to focus as part of this project is to trouble how this notion of academic hypermobility, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the context of our project, reflects institutionalized norms of consumption, energy use, transport, and all of these are associated with models of what it means to be a successful academic, a good professional in international higher education, especially in hegemonic global north higher education models. So in terms of what we want to do with our project, we really want to talk about this normalization of academic hypermobility. And this will be important to stress this difference between what we see as academic mobility, the flow of individuals crossing borders, doing research, doing study. And that's important because we're not advocating for an anti-internationalization or anti-mobility stance. Rather, for what we really want to trouble is the notion of, and that goes beyond academia, this idea of being hyper mobile, of being, if you're able to travel, then you do without stopping to think, what is the impact that I'm having in the world. And here, we first saw this concept used by Glover, Strangers, and Lewis, and they're talking specifically about academic air travel. We believe that this goes beyond air travel, but for the purposes, of starting a discussion, it's useful to think only in terms of air travel. And their point they're trying to make is that academic air travel, we have to understand it in terms of broader institutional orientations of the university sector, where even though institutions may have sustainability initiatives in place, even sustainability institutes like the case of Loyola, there is a tendency, there is a certain amount of pressure, or mobilizing careers by participating in new and expanded arrays of collaboration, teaching, research practices. And so the point that we really want to take from their work is that by sidestepping questions about why academics fly, why we engage in these forms of hypermobility, then we are legitimizing more of it. and not really getting at the core of where we can have an impact as individuals and collectively. Now, this we believe is particularly pertinent in the case of academic and professional practice in the hegemonic global north. And it has to be considered within structures, broader structures, that enable, encourage, and enshrine hypermobility as an aspirational status quo. And I'll give you an example in the next slide to show what we mean by this. So on the left-hand text, we have some of the challenges in calculating greenhouse gas emissions of international students and scholars. Here, this formula is from the Higher Education Funding Council of England, and it's the model that they were using initially and that Davis and Dunk were looking at in their article for calculating the greenhouse emission footprint of an international student. And so with this formula, we have that D is the return flight trip distance. So for example, when I was an international student in Canada, the return flight distance would have been between Chihuahua, CUU, and Vancouver. And then they calculate the number of return flights per year. So for me, that would have been, I was there for 2 years, and I went back to visit my family once in those 2 years. And then they calculate the distance factor. So how long is it a short haul, long haul type of trip. Now, the point that Davis and Dunk are doing is that this kind of calculation doesn't account for the complete service use profile of an international student, in that it doesn't consider, for example, friends and families that may come to visit the international scholar or student, trips within the host country, trips to third countries, and so forth and so on. Now, we really appreciate the point that Davis and Dunk are doing, but I think part of our discussion is that it doesn't account for very important differences once we start talking about international graduate students, for scholars, for faculty, and especially how varying degrees of privilege, of resources, complicities in contributing to climate change and global inequities become embedded in this. So this is really where we're trying to grapple with what this means. And so, for example, with this formula, the focus is exclusively on the individual rather than the institutional and societal structures that promote or even necessitate even increasing forms of mobility. So again, taking into my own experience as an international student, first in Canada and then as a doctoral student in the US. Once I came to the US to do my doctorate, I really became embedded in this much broader, much more pervasive hypermobile culture and even infrastructure. You had to have a car in Tucson just to be able to get around, to get groceries, the most basic things. And that has to do with how this country has been set up. And we also need to consider how this is embedded in a culture, almost a worship of student relocation in pursuit of the best college, which is very quintessentially American, I think. In Mexico, for example, to a large extent, you still go to university where your family is located, or if you go to a different location, it's still not far, or you stay with family, so the culture is very different. Since this takes a different modalities, for example, in the case of Europe, that are very specific to the context, to the infrastructure, the history of the region. And also, we believe that this tendency, once I became a doctoral student, I also became embedded into this culture that really privileges being a cosmopolitan, being hyper visible, and attending conferences to show that I was dedicated, that I was serious about being a scholar. And how this, the more we progress on the hiring ladder, for example, it becomes embedded in promotion procedures and standards. And we also have to take in consideration the role of relative prestige of alternate modalities of internationalization. So in my case, getting an online degree from an institution abroad would not have made me eligible for certain types of scholarships that were offered by the Mexican government, which enabled me to, study outside of Mexico, but would not have considered an online degree as the equivalent of that. So some of the things that we're trying to do, and that you may have got a sense of this in the example, is to use an intersectional lens. Both Max and I are in the global north. We come from very different backgrounds, but we are both embedded in this place and in this culture, or intersecting communities and ways of doing. So for us, it's really important to start with ourselves, to turn our gaze through an intersectional lens toward our own experiences as differently positioned actors in the hegemonic North, to illuminate the troubled norms of academic and professional hypermobility, which really reinforce unequal structures of power through what may be seen as common sense established practices such as tenure procedures, hiring procedures, the socialization of doctoral students, and so on and so forth. Now, we also want to stress that we want to take a critical perspective and the inherent contradictions and paradoxes that come with this. After Pashby and Andreotti, we want to acknowledge and really grapple with the historical tendency in a lot of the literature on educating for sustainability, and even in just in sustainable practice and call for action of overemphasizing individual behavioral change at the expense of wider social processes. And this is a notion, as they very eloquently talk about, that is deeply embedded in historical and ongoing processes of racialization, dispossession, destitution, exploitation, and genocide that are inextricably associated with climate change. So after them, and again, we really want to stress this perspective of this departure point of humility. Our analysis is premised on a very provisional, improvisational, imperfect ethics of doubleness, which seeks to make visible these complicated and often paradoxical relations of complicity with mainstream ideas of sustainability, especially in higher education, institutional practice. But also, we want to move beyond a mea culpa and want to create space for new vocabularies and imaginings and possibilities for intervention to facilitate more self-reflexive and consciously situated decisions. And they make an absolutely beautiful point that it's necessary to move beyond thinking about individual and collective footprint and also think about our handprints. What are we doing to make change both individually and collectively, and to push our institutions to make change? Now, Max will talk a little bit more about what that means in his case from the perspective of a scholar practitioner, and also trying to root this initial thinking in an intersectional positionality analysis, but then what this means in terms of thinking about footprint and handprint.
Though I am an international education PhD student, my professional past and future trajectory is in administrative and staff positions in international education. In my experience, the expectations of hypermobility of academia are mirrored in higher education administrative positions. This slide shows a simplified overview of my mobility history as it relates to my professional life, all of which were interspersed with personal, domestic, and international mobility as a young adult. My mobility opportunities were born from the combination of my family's class status as well as cultural capital. As a result of these, I was able to study abroad as an undergraduate student. which then paved the way for a funded year of working abroad. That year abroad cemented my interest in international education as a professional field, which required continued accumulation of professional development and mobility opportunities in order to advance in the field. I eventually landed a role in international education, but to continue to advance, there were and are continued institutional expectations to consistently engage in professional development and international activities, which require significant domestic and international travel. My doctoral studies similarly require consistent engagement with conference and research opportunities requiring significant mobility. This simple overview shows the cumulative effects of mobility, that is, how mobility begets more mobility. This leads to the question of whether or not professional requirements and advancement will necessitate or strongly incentivize hypermobility without end until retirement. This leads us back to the idea introduced earlier regarding the necessity of both reducing one's carbon footprint and increasing one's institutional handprint. Our ultimate aim with this project is to devise, with the input of colleagues from this conference, an instrument for self-reflection and action that is geared towards supporting faculty and staff in the twin projects of reducing the individual impact of expected hypermobility while also making changes to the institutional arrangements that demand it. We see these 6 questions as starting points for consideration of the ways this instrument might ultimately be devised to support these 2 projects to attend to issues of academic hypermobility. First, in an effort to explore opportunities to reduce the individual carbon footprint of our mobility as scholars and professionals, we ask, where at the intersection of my professional mobility opportunities are there opportunities for reducing my carbon footprint? What room and responsibility do I have for reimagining ways to progress in my field that are less reliant on hypermobility in order to reduce the environmental impact of my current ways of being? How do the accumulative effects of my privileges, opportunities, and experiences position me and my hypermobility in relation to academics and professionals who started from a different point or a global location or who are more junior in my field? Second, in an effort to explore opportunities to change the institutional structures that incentivize and require hypermobility of international education scholars and professionals, we ask, in what ways are potential reimagined pursuits bound or hindered by institutions of which I am a part? What concrete actions are within our spheres of influence in service of reimagining common sense behaviors, expectations, and norms of higher education institutions that have historically been at odds with climate justice imperatives? And finally, with whom can I collaborate to strive for change? We approach the development of this future instrument from a place of humility and, through initial discussion of and engagement with these questions through this conference, with an eye on issues of equity as it relates to different experiences and positionalities for international education scholars and administrators in locations around the world and at different points in their careers.